black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson. I would like to welcome you to part two of a dynamic discussion Brother Derek and I left off on the last show, the two-part show in which we introduced an economic concept that's been around for decades, and an individual who's been putting this out there for a decade, Dr. Claude Anderson. And maybe you know about these two or five books that he had, but we're going to focus on these two. We talked about the discussion based on black labor, white wealth, which was like the history when you want to ask the question, how do we get to where we are economically as black people? This brother put it all in that book. This show, we're going to do our discussion based on the problem solving that he put together in this book, Powernomics, that came out like in 2001 or 2000. The first book, Black Wealth, came out like in 94. And everything since then that he's been speaking to this very day, he's still alive, still an elder now in his 80s, but he still says the same thing. And this brother is a powerful brother. But before I go any further, let me let you know who I am for those of who might not know who this show is about. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson. Alongside me is my Rafiki, or in the Kiswahili language, Brother Derek Williams. It means friend in the Kiswahili language. And this is an African-centered talk show where we correct errors where errors are found, and we introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when they talk about us as a people. And the reason we put this show together is to dissuade that fiction. As one of our mentors and teachers, Malcolm, who once said, it's called the established order logic. It is the logic of the dominant group to determine, to justify the actions historically of that dominant group. And if we only speak their language, we always going to be counter to what we need. Absolutely. And how we must talk. Absolutely. But we got to understand that we have a unique history and we have a new relationship in America, and we must speak from that truth. When we talk about minorities, or to use terms like that, Dr. Claude Anderson will tell you that is a misnomer, because in the Constitution, it says, like I brought up in the previous show, the Constitution said the majority wins. And yes, economically, if you are part of that minority, you are not going to win because you won't have the power. And if we believe in this thing called minority, he said that in this book that we're going to be bringing up, for example, that you must, where you are the majority population in that community, then as a team, collectively, you got to vie for that power to manipulate the systems and control you. Places like Detroit got 87% black population, but we're still acting as if we're a bunch of individual and minorities. Yes. And that dilutes who we are. No other group does that. Yes. But before we get into the discussion, I got a few images I'd like to show you that we'll start the discussion off of. This is a powerful reality by Dr. Claude Anderson, who said this: the 40 million melanated Americans spend $1.1 trillion a year. If we spent 1/3 of this with each other, we'll all be millionaires in 2 years. Okay, and what he's talking about, if we had the communities that we used to have in the early 1900s throughout the late 1800s that were constantly destroyed, and where everything circulate within 8 to 10 times within that community, we have our own banks, our own insurance companies, our own hotels, movie theaters, all these things like Black Wall Street, all these places that did exist in the black communities. He said, one thing we have now, brother, and he said we have nothing but neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are where you sleep and eat. and then you go off bypassing black businesses, and you go spend it somewhere else. That $1.1 trillion dollars. This next image, he said this from his previous book, Black Labor, White Wealth. In 1860, 99% of all black people worked for whites. Today, 98% of all black people work for whites. You are enjoying a social illusion because you go to someone else's restaurant, theaters, etc., but you don't own the restaurant yourself. Dr. Claude Anderson, one of his favorite quotes, because he's always saying this is economics based on ownership.
Yes.
And
yes.
you, as the owner of your own business, understand that. And then you got this image here that Mike, this next image here, it is a herd of wildebeest, and this was based on a lecture I saw, in which he talks about that verbally. I just put that visual image to point out when he talked about the $1.1 trillion that we spend annually, which is like the seventh largest GDP of seventh largest country in the world, but we don't own anything. We're functioning like these wildebeest. You see how massive and the potential and how powerful each individual animal is. But black folks spending is just as powerful, but we don't know it. The thing about this wildebeest herd that goes across the annual migration across the Serengeti, if you ever seen it, it is a powerful sight and that overwhelms your senses when you see them. But each individual do his own thing. And Dr. Claude Anderson said, like the wildebeest, every other animal or group who attach that herd do it as a group.
Yes.
You know, whether the lions, they do it as a tribe, whether the group of wild dogs who are very smaller than the wildebeest, but they'll bring one down because they act as a group. He said economics is a group activity, not an individual activity. You can't do it unless you are a majority you concentrate your wealth. And that's the problem that we've had. We've been disconnected from ourselves. All other groups, the glue that keeps them together is their cultural connection. And every group is vying. Even in article of the Article of Confederation and the Constitution, they talked about majority rule, bro.
Yes. And the thing that Dr. Anderson so plainly lays out, as he, in his first book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and the people would come to him and say, hey, you've explained to us the conditions that have created our economic downfall or depravity. What we want you to do is to tell us what we need to do, the how to fix that. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, was the foundation of the Pyronomics principle, the national plan for Black America. And essentially what Dr. Anderson is saying is that the one thing that we do not have, with all of the civil rights movements, with all of the things that we've done for the past hundreds of years, is that we have failed to come up with an effective economic plan to emancipate ourselves freely through the economics of self-determination. And so, you know, the relationship is understand how we got here, and of course, the study has to be, now how do we free ourselves of this continued wildebeest approach to economics?
Because everybody else is feeding off us every year.
Absolutely.
Every year.
But we have to understand, I mean, you know, it's easy sometimes to define a problem, but we don't look at the complexity of how the problem was created.
Exactly.
We were, in fact, victims of being made to labor under gun, and every institution worked together to continue to keep us as an uncompensated free labor force. And so we have to recognize, I mean, we're not superhuman beings. If you control a system and you control all aspects of that system, you got termites in your foundation, and you've made us 3/4 of a human being, and then you develop all sorts of laws to maintain and to keep us from being able to come together collectively. We understand that, and we need to talk about that, but we also need to focus on what do we do to not be wildebeest. And that's what Brother Claude Anderson so elegantly points out by giving us a Pyronomics plan, to do that.
Exactly.
For us to begin to look at ourselves as, he says that we have no permanent friends, okay? We have no permanent interests, okay? That we show progress only when we work together collectively. There is no group in America that's interested in seeing us progress and take a piece of that pie. Everyone is working collectively together saying what do we need to do to become functional. But when you've been kept out of the circle, when you've been kept out of the plan, and you spend all of your time trying to get in, and you don't accept your personal appearance, and the conditions of slavery has actually caused you to hate each other to the point of feeling you cannot make it unless you got white folk involved. And that's a mythology. And we know it's a mythology because we've seen what happened when we had to do it ourselves.
And we got to understand there's a science that's called social engineering.
Yes.
They got people who are expert in how to socialize certain groups of people in your society. And what was done, whether knowledgeably or not, I know in maybe 100, 200 years ago, they had no name social engineering, but the way the system was established, especially after 1865, what will be called in the social engineering circles today is just that. Because we are a country of laws.
Yes.
And laws shape behaviors, right?
Yes.
You stop at a stoplight without even thinking today, because of a law that said 100 years ago that you're going to do that. Before that law you didn't have that kind of dynamic.
Yes.
We are conditioned to do these things by these laws. And when you have socially engineered laws that said that you can't go into this store, or in I like to quote, they call it Dictate of Maryland. It came out in 1638. This is around the time they started shifting from indentured servitude for blacks, because the first 20 who came off those ships in 1690 were indentured, but they were indentured white Europeans, poor whites coming over here to work those crops that you brought up in the previous shows, because sugarcane and cotton and rice, these are labor-intensive crops, and they need mass labor to do that. And this was an economic system. These crops, there's a book called Sugar Blues, which shows how addictive sugar was. So it was in high demand, but you needed labor. But sugarcane caused it. The average enslaved person on the sugarcane plantation, or I should say plantation, that's one of those, again, European terms to minimize. These were labor slave camps.
That's all they were.
Was 7 years.
7 years.
So these labor-intensive crops needed more bodies, and they used these Africans who were used to the climate that was similar in the South Carolinas and in the southern states, who knew these because for the ancient Africans with thousands of years we've grown crops like that. But that's not what we hear in our history books. That's another story. But the value that came from that labor is the foundation of the American wealth that makes America. It wasn't liberty, it wasn't justice, it wasn't the American way. It was black labor, like the first book said, that was the foundation of the economic system. And then after that, it was to maintain that dynamic. Again, racism is a competition between groups for the economic. It's economic racism. That's socially engineered, and we were socially engineered into an underclass when we were free. So when you're socially engineered into an underclass, and you got laws that keep you in that status, and when you break out of that status, then you are criminalized.
Yes.
Okay, then you see that this was not something that was done by nature.
No.
This was deliberately done
it was
to maintain power when you have 98% of the wealth, as the white people, because of enslavement, sent all that wealth to the white population. You gotta, in that book, they talk about the bottom-up function of an economic system. I think it was in that book you talked about that in this society is always from the bottom up. You always got the upper class, and then you got the lower class. And the upper class is always doing things in order to maintain a power.
Yes, maintain power and economic power and dominance. And the idea that blacks in America and blacks around the world today, what Dr. Claude Anderson again insists that we begin to look at is doing an assessment of our strengths, our economic strengths, the things that we spend our money on, and to recognize the power in that. The black people spend more money on clothes, leather. We dominate in areas of sports and entertainment, but the
Certain
one thing that we
foods.
don't do is we don't form our own coalitions. And Dr. Anderson, while he can enumerate all of the causations, he insists that if you don't take that information, practice what others did to us in terms of economic control, that our future generations will continue to repeat the same thing over and over and over. So Powernomics thinking is essential, that we begin to look at our power, our strengths, and what it's going to take to collectively begin to be in charge of ourselves. And we say, well, whether or not that's through being an entrepreneur, but as you pointed out, many black businesses focus on their own functionality rather than the functionality of the community.
Yeah,
okay?
exactly.
And out of $1, and I think it's important that, and we've used these correlations, out of $1, 95% of that dollar is spent with majority group members, and that leaves a nickel. And of that nickel, 3% is spent with other groups, Hispanics, people from Asians from other groups, and that leaves 2%, 2 pennies for us to maintain our own community, maintain our own businesses, and that is physically and it's economically impossible. And so if we don't talk about the process that we have to use to begin to practice buying from each other, experimenting with producing our own items, this conversation will be the same today as it will be in the future.
Exactly.
And so,
as it's been in the past, why do we lose? We always show pride every February about Black Wall Street. When 1921, the disaster
we
that
talk
happened.
about that all the time.
Yeah, cities like Oklahoma, people don't realize there was many Black Wall Street that were destroyed. And the year before Black Wall Street, in 1921, there was in Florida a city where they had North Oklahoma, Florida, where there was wealthy blacks who owned land. One man went to vote in November of 1920, and it formed a riot. The same thing happened to Oklahoma, that happened to Black Wall Street. And then that was what we would call, happening in Russia, called a pogrom. Well, all the land that was owned by those blacks in 1920, Oklahoma, Florida, was taken over. Because what if I came to your house tonight and said, you have an hour to get out of town? Okay.
And those stories repeat themselves.
And those are the economic, because the man who went to vote was one of the richest men in that county. He was black, and he was run out of town. His friend, when he went to go to the house, was killed, murdered, because he was protecting him,
And see, those are examples of the conditions that not only existed, but the economic jealousy that whites and other groups had towards us. And so when people ask the question, well, why can't we? We must understand the conditioning process that has been put into play. I mean, even today, let's talk about the east side of San Antonio. I mean, how many corner stores can you find where there's a black person that owns that store? How many housing areas? the question I ask is, how many black people owe money to other black people? And while you may owe, while you may owe somebody some money, the idea that most of the debt that you have is to whites and other groups, and that speaks to the condition that we basically are consumers. And if we continue to be consumers and we don't begin to practice the group economics and experiment with our own creative forces of
Yeah, Dr. Anderson
economics,
was drumming that in
it just-
over and
it's just not
over
gonna
and
happen,
over
Smoke.
again. Let me read you a statistic that you might find interesting based on this the 2020 census. As the people, as those wildebeests, and as suspending
Like that.
$1.3 trillion, I think that's what the number is right now. We have approximately 2.6 million black-owned businesses. Okay, 2.5 million only have one employee. Of the 2.6 million in that community, said we talk about
Wow.
the 5 cents or the 2 cents
Wow.
that's in our communities
Yeah.
throughout the country. Okay, 2.5 of that 2.6 million entrepreneurs only have one. How, when you have other communities that are, first of all, the money is circulating 8 to 12 times. They have their own banks. Everybody's touching it, you know, in that community.
Yes.
But we have other groups coming in and touching our money. We'll go and spend to somebody who, you know, I've seen these hip hop artists go to people who are Arabs who own jewelry stores, or in New York there's a whole block of Jewish people who have diamonds, who control the diamonds in that block, you know, and then and we go right there at those wildebeests and spend.
Yes.
And they ignore. We don't have no black diamond shops. Or you'll see a rapper spend $100,000 for a chain, a diamond encrusted chain, but that money goes to the Arab store owner, who has the right, because he know us better than we know ourselves.
Yes.
And we go in there and react as individuals for status.
Yes.
We consume to uphold an image of ourselves.
Yes.
But who pushes forth that image?
Yes, when we need to melt the gold down and do something good with it. Absolutely. I think that's an excellent example. And, you know, you can't blame others for building wealth upon
It's
us.
a competitive.
We have to blame ourselves for allowing it to occur.
Exactly.
And Dr. Anderson, you know, the compressing this topic into an hour is so challenging and difficult.
Yeah.
But I think
We'll
if
address it again.
we don't get anything else out of our discussion other than we have to believe that we can. We have to accept the idea that as second-class citizens, if you don't get much, you can imagine what you're going to get as third-class citizens, and that other groups do not have our interest in hand economically, and the only reason why we are hired is because for the labor and to minimize the pay. Until we determine the acquisition of our own labor and building our own businesses, we cannot possibly compete with the other groups. And the groups are increasingly entering this country from other nations and other countries.
Living the American dream.
And they're coming in with group economics in mind. And many of them are coming to the black community, building businesses and extrapolating the funds that we have in our community, okay? And those numbers are not diminishing at all.
No.
And so we are
no.
becoming perpetual consumers and spending that dollar and only getting 2 cents out of it. So it's a must. It's a necessity, a vital necessity, that we begin to practice group economics if our children's children and their children are going to survive.
Well, if we
in
tell our
America.
children, if you go to school and do good and do better, we learned that from another great scholar, Dr. Amos Wilson,
Yes.
when he talked about black economics is similar work. He said it, but if you don't have anything to give them once they go to college, like it used to be back in the day, you go to college, we'll put you into school. It might be a black university.
Even staying in the community and getting a job with a local factory. The factories are gone.
Yeah, and then come back and then as a teacher, you spend a couple of times in the community, we will support you. That's what we used to do. Yes. We were a collective. Yes. And Dr. Anderson always drummed in, you can't dilute yourself into individuals. You have to function in this system as a collective.
Absolutely.
Economic is a team sport. You can't play baseball, you can't play basketball, you can't play football as a as an individual. You got to do it as a team in order to win.
And you can't practice capitalism without capital.
Exactly. and that's the thing we keep on getting. So that's why that $1.3 trillion go into other groups, because they work as a concentrated collective.
Yes.
And I mean, even in the Constitution, again, like I said in the previous show, it says that majority rules.
Yes.
And if you are not part of the majority in your area, because politics is local, that's what. How could you have a majority black population in a particular city, but the minority white population run everything?
That's right.
And they concentrate. Then that means a minority system is running your system, which contradicts the edict of the Constitution, where majority is supposed to rule. And we constantly getting laws that does not fit and best help our local situation. It's not going to change, like you said.
Yes. Well said. And I would hope, because of the import of this topic, Smokey, it's obvious to me that this must be an ongoing topic to awaken the sleeping giant economically, and for us to begin to practice those group economic principles in order for our group to survive.
Dr. Anderson, a little quote again that I always write down, Dr. Anderson, because I follow him.
Do.
Yeah, he said that a belief that if the African American community is to maximize its economics, like you're saying, economic power, that it must maximize wealth through the organization of an economic system by which you can acquire open produce and distribute the economic resource in such a way as to provide for its own group. We don't do that, because we don't have one out of 2.6 million black-owned businesses. 2.5 million is only one, and barely making it above, economically. There's a problem with that. There's a nice word, entrepreneur, but if you're not surviving and we do that, we don't have a collective. What does the dominant group do? Don't they take over corporations, take over each other, and concentrate their wealth?
That's right.
But we have to leave this right here and pass it on to the next one.
I hope we can commit to revisit this on a continuous basis, Smokey.
But until then, peace.